This is ILM Circle, a learning workshop presented by the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, or ISBA. ILM stands for Intentional Learning for Mutual Respect, the foundation of what ISBA is all about.
Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us this evening. This is our July ILM Circle, and tonight's discussion is the birth of women's ordination in the Rabbinate. I am Michelle Marion, and I'm one of the volunteers with the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona. And I'll say this again as a reminder at the end, but I also want to remind you or invite you to next month's events that the Islamic Speakers Bureau is hosting. On August 15th, there is a tri-faith discussion that will be happening at 6 p.m. And then on August 22nd, another ILM Circle, Muslim Bosniaks in North America. And so we will welcome your attendance at both of those if it fits into your schedule, and are very appreciative of that. As I said, tonight's presentation is the birth of women's ordination in the Rabbinate. And it is my pleasure to be here and be able to introduce and kind of moderate the session with Rabbi Elana Kanter. And Rabbi Kanter presently serves as the director of the Women's Leadership Institute, a program for expanding the presence of women in Jewish communal decision-making. Rabbi Kanter received her Bachelor of Arts degree in English Literature from Barnard College in 1982, and she was a member of the first class of women of Jewish Theological Seminary's Rabbinical School, where she was ordained in 1989. Before devoting herself full-time to women's learning and leadership, Rabbi Kanter worked with Jewish day schools across the United States for 25 years as a teacher, administrator, and consultant. And in 1998, Rabbi Kanter received the Covenant Award for Exceptional Jewish Educators. In addition to her work with the Women's Leadership Institute, Rabbi Kanter serves as the co-rabbi for the new shul in Scottsdale. We will have a presentation from Rabbi Kanter, and then we'll have time at the end for question and answers. If you do have a question, as she's presenting, if you want to put it in the chat, I will gladly present that to her. And then at the end, we can unmute or you can still put it in the chat. So either one is fine. But we welcome all of you, and we certainly welcome Rabbi Kanter for this wonderful and very informative presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me and for having me. Since we're a small group, Michelle, we can be a little bit less, we can just jump in as needed. So I do encourage you we can have this more as a conversation. But I'm going to be telling you the story of women's ordination, really as a personal story, because I happened to be involved at the beginning and there for the beginning. And when I'm talking about the beginning, I'm talking about the beginning of women in the Rabbinate of conservative Judaism. In America, we have three labels. I would call them labels because they're not so great at representing groups of people anymore. But there's the Reform branch of Judaism, there's conservative, and then there's Orthodox. And actually, none of those are monoliths. But the part of Judaism that I'm going to be talking about is ordination in, in the conservative movement. In the Reform movement of Judaism, their first female rabbi was ordained in 1972. And ours was 1985. So they were 13 years ahead of us. and we learned from them along the way. But the story of the women's ordination in the conservative rabbinate is a story of change. And we all know about change. Change can be very hard for people. It's, new things, there are a few of us in this world who embrace change, but there are a lot of us who, will go kicking and screaming into the future because it's something fearful. And all of those things occurred in this story. So I'm going to take you back to the 1970s. This is the early 1970s. And this is when in America, feminism is really Betty Friedan, and, this is exploding in American culture. And Judaism is very much a part of American culture and draws from it as well as contributes to it. So this is the 1970s, early 1970s, and I am growing up in Sharon, Massachusetts, and I come from a rabbinic family. My father was a conservative rabbi, and he had a little synagogue in Sharon, Massachusetts, which is about 40 minutes south of Boston. And at that time, the first bat mitzvah, which is a kind of coming of age ceremony for girls, boys had it for a very, very long time. For girls, the first one was in 1922. But it had kind of caught on already by the 1970s. And certainly in the reform and conservative movements, having a bat mitzvah for a girl was something that was very common. And so I was approaching my bat mitzvah, and this story is also the story of inconsistencies. So here comes inconsistency number one. I'm approaching my bat mitzvah. I prepare to chant a part of the prophets, but the rule in the synagogue is you get to chant once at your bat mitzvah and then never again, because women aren't allowed to chant except at your bat mitzvah. Doesn't quite so much make sense, but those were what the rules were. And in fact, in my synagogue, women had no role in leading prayer, in being called to the Torah, which is an honor, being counted as part of the prayer quorum. None of that was happening in the synagogue in which I grew up. And there certainly were there were no women rabbis around. I said that the Reform movement had just ordained their first one, but in terms of being part of Jewish culture, this was not something that I certainly had no role models of women rabbis when I was growing up. So, so here's another inconsistency. I am in an Orthodox day school in Brookline, Massachusetts, and because of my background, I love prayer and I love Jewish studies and I love anything, my favorite place to be is to be in the synagogue, in shul. And so, so I, whenever I can go to pray, I do happily, like I run. So at 3 o'clock every day, the bell would ring at this day school, and we would have, it was time for afternoon prayers. And so there was like a little synagogue within the school. And the way the synagogue was, it was an Orthodox. So the men had the central section, and then on the wings sat the women. And there were barriers in between the men's section and the women's section. So I would run so that I could pray and sit behind that barrier and in our little women's section. Except the problem was that even though I was of age, I was 13, I didn't count in the number of Jews that you needed to have a quorum to be able to pray certain parts of that service. So what they used to have to do was to go to the boys' bathroom and pull the boys out of the stalls, so and push them into the synagogue, so that we could have the quorum, because only they who just didn't want to be there, only they were the ones who counted in the prayer quorum. So as girls, we're looking at this and it doesn't quite make sense to us. So after being in that Orthodox day school for a number of years, I switched schools and I went to a school where I was one of 2 Jews in my class, one of very, very few Jews in the school. And the school was very accommodating to me and my needs. They gave me my own office so that I could pray. I mean, it wasn't my office, but they made it available to me. But we're sitting in an English class, and one of my friends in class raises her hand. I can't even remember what we're talking about. And she says, "Isn't it true that Jews have a blessing saying, 'Thank you, God, for not making me a woman'?" Well, that is true. We have that blessing in the traditional liturgy. That is not a blessing that I say, but that blessing is in the traditional liturgy. So on the one hand, so I hear this question, and I'm jumping to the defense of Judaism. It's like, because I'm one of the only Jews there, so I have to defend, Judaism. And I'm like sort of spouting something that one of my rabbis taught me from this Orthodox day school. But, it's sort of like this bubble is in my head as I'm mouthing the words to give this explanation. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, there's something really wrong here. So then it all came to a kind of, the absurdity of it all kind of came to a head when I was 18. And because of how much I loved prayer and I loved study, I would sit in synagogue and really just kind of absorb a lot of the praying skills by osmosis. And our High Holiday liturgy is a very, very complicated liturgy. But I would sit in shul for hours and hours and hours. I loved it. And, it just kind of went in there. So when I was 18, I have 2 wonderful brothers. My brothers were offered positions at small synagogues for the high holidays, so that they would lead services for the high holidays. The only problem was that they didn't know the liturgy. So I had to teach my brothers the liturgy so that they could lead these services in the synagogues, which at that point, I was not a candidate for. I could not, it was not permitted for me to lead the services at that time, but I could teach some male relatives so that they could. So it kind of, the contradiction here made itself known. So I go to college, and I'm right down the road from my Barnard College is about 6 blocks. Is that right? 8 blocks from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, which is where conservative rabbis are studied. And because of my own commitments, I go to their morning service every morning. And, so zoom down, pray the morning service, zoom back, go to class. at the time, so this is 1978, 1979, the question of women's ordination has become hot and bothered in the conservative movement. At the Jewish Theological Seminary itself, discussions are going on like night and day. Are we going to do this? Is it possible to do this? All these people want us to move ahead in this way. There's a moral imperative here. There are all sorts of reasons for us to make this move. Our Reformed brothers and sisters have done so very successfully. But on the other hand, the traditionalists among us are saying, but how can we change tradition this way? This would be a radical change. And radical change can be scary, except that if you look in Jewish history, so what's today? Today's Tuesday. On Thursday, on the Jewish calendar, we remember the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, both temples, one in 586 before the Common Era, and then one in 70. So we remember the destruction of these temples, and particularly the second temple, we went from a sacrifice-centered religion to a religion that was centered around Torah study and prayer. It was a radical shift. So when you look at Jewish history, it's not like we haven't made radical changes. We have, and they've been very important to the vitality and the continuity of Judaism. But still, people get very, very afraid. So the conservative movement decided, we're going to put together a task force. What happens when change is hard? Let's have a task force. So they put together a task force, and they charged this task force with going all over the United States, go to all the cities and all the different states, and do a listening tour and see what the rank and file members of the conservative movement want to, what are the people thinking about these days? What do they want? We definitely had leadership who were saying this is absolutely not possible. But there was really a groundswell out there, but the seminary in New York was not really in touch with it. So, so we got this task force. Task force goes all over the country, comes back to New York, and one of my fellow prayers at that morning service happened to be a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, who I got to know simply because we prayed together every morning, 5 days a week. And he said to me, I really think that you should testify before this commission, this task force. I found it, on the one hand, it was an honor. On the other hand, what am I going to say? So I did. I was mostly interested in the Jewish legal questions having to do with this change of women's role in Judaism. So how is it legally that women can be counted as part of the prayer quorum, or how does it work in terms of Jewish law for women to be able to be called to the Torah? And so, I gave my 2 cents in front of this task force, and I thought, that's good, great. And that was over. But then in the next couple of years, the question would not go away. And in the fall of 1983, things had gotten to a head, and the Jewish Theological Seminary scheduled a vote of the faculty. They're going to vote on the question of admitting women to the rabbinical school. And so you had the professors on the traditionalist side scheduling sessions called "The Seminary is on the Brink of Disaster." That was like a flyer put up all over the place that people should come and listen to this one professor as he told us, that the seminary was about to make a terrible, terrible mistake. And, but again, the other thing was that when you would go in the doors of that institution, like you could actually feel the tension in the air. It's like you could cut it with a knife. It was so awful. People who, used to be friends, who were on different sides of the argument, were having a great deal of trouble, everybody felt like everything's on the line here. Anyway, so fall 1983, they vote to open the rabbinical school to women, which was wonderful for people like me. And so then, so they, admissions were open. So I applied and started with the first class of women in the fall of 1984. So when you're in the first class, what happens is there are tons and tons of things which you just happen to be first at, because you're in that, that's the time of history. So there were 19 of us, 19 women, including people in their 50s and 60s who had waited their whole lives for the conservative movement to open up its rabbinical school. The very first morning of rabbinical school for that year, I got to lead services in the seminary's synagogue. And that was the first time in the history of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is, over 100 years old, that had happened. Or I was the first woman who was placed by the rabbinical school student placement service in a high holiday placement. Or when I took my first job in Atlanta, Georgia, I was the first female conservative rabbi in Georgia, so there were a lot of firsts. And as you might imagine, we got there were predictably very hurt reactions to just our existence, the fact that women were in the rabbinical school. So I had somebody come up to me in the synagogue where my husband was working at the time. And, I don't know why he felt he needed to say this to me, but he said, "I will pay all the money in the world to make sure you never get a job." And he was a very wealthy man, so he could have paid all the money in the world. No, but he was European born, and this was something unfathomable to him. So I didn't, on the one hand, it wasn't a nice thing to do. On the other hand, he was an older guy, and I just sort of attributed it to that way. One of the things that I got a lot was, "Hi, you don't look like a rabbi. You don't look like a rabbi," because I didn't, in the sense of, if all of your models of rabbis are men, and many of them, and most of them men's with beards, then when you see a woman, yes, she's not going to look like the rabbis that you have been exposed to your whole life. So you'd have to invent these comeback lines. So people would say, "You don't look like a rabbi." And so I would say, "That's what a rabbi looks like," or they would say, "You're too young to be a rabbi." And I would say, "You age quickly in this job, don't worry." So, there were a lot of, people, or like people would somebody who I I knew, like, gives me a kiss on the cheek, and he says, "Oh, it's the first time I've kissed a rabbi," and it's like you want to say, "Okay, yes, very exciting." So just some of the larger some of the things that I learned particularly in those early years, where the reception of us was very mixed, in the sense of, not that we weren't all, very capable young rabbis, but, there was a lot of suspicion and a lot of worry about, what Judaism was going to look like after we got our hands on it. But what I found was that competence always overcame prejudice. In other words, when somebody needed a rabbi and you could function as a rabbi for them, suddenly the whole gender issue just kind of falls away, because they need you and you are capable and you can help. And so many times that was the case. Or they would be surprised that we actually knew about Judaism. I don't know what they were expecting out of women rabbis as different from men rabbis. But, when you study for 5 or 6 years after your bachelor's degree, you've got a lot of Jewish learning under your belt, and you have a lot to offer. So sometimes it was just showing people, oh yeah, yes, I can explain that to you, or I can help you with this. So part of it was that, part of it was just, regular sexism from people, which is unfortunately, let's see. So I was ordained in 1989. So 2029 will be 40 years for me. Is that right? 89, 2029. Is that right? Yeah. So I've been I've been a rabbi for 30 plus years. Sexism is still alive and well in our in the United States of America, and in many Jewish circles as well. So the sexism that was happening there, it took a different form. Now it's more subtle, it's less structural, but it's still here, and it's still a challenge. So I think we've come very far, but not as far as we need. In the beginning, people wouldn't interview women for jobs. They would say, sorry, thank you, but no thank you. You would apply, or you would want to apply, and congregations would say no. Finally, our professional organization put its foot down and said, no, you have to interview women. You don't have to hire them, but you must interview them. Okay, so yeah, I've been talking a long time. Let's take a question, since I see there is one.
So Judy has the question, how did the women of your first congregation react to your arrival? And kind of a follow-up, was there a difference in their reception to you than from the men?
Yeah, so let's see. So the early part of my rabbinate, I did spend some time in pulpit jobs, but most of my time was in Jewish education. And because Jewish education was populated by a lot of women, it was, in some ways, it was much easier to be in those, in those positions. Sometimes in the synagogues that I would just go to as a person, when I was an educator 5 days a week, and then, on Saturday we'd be going to synagogue. In some of the synagogues that I went to, they didn't quite know what to do with me. Like one synagogue that I was at, it wasn't my custom at the time to wear a head covering. And they were, like I'm walking into the synagogue and they said, no, you cannot be here unless you put on a head covering, and that it certainly wasn't anything standard, but I don't know, when change is happening, people often get very rigid about things, so like, okay, we'll let this change happen, but, it's got to be this way. But in terms of reception by men and women, one thing that was wonderful is the women of the conservative movement and their sort of sisterhood organization were some of the biggest proponents of women's ordination. They were real supporters in terms of moving things forward and just supporting us as we went out to our congregations. But other experiences, I would say, what we would, I don't think I ever got outright sort of hostility from women particularly. Most of the encounters that I had where people were sort of openly hostile were men. But as the years progressed, it just became more subtle, like I would know why somebody was being openly hostile to me, except, it wouldn't be named. You couldn't name it. So you would just have to cope. And that was fine, as long as you knew what the real story was, you knew how to deal with it. I'm happy to take questions. I have a few other things though that I did want to, that I could.
And if I could just kind of follow up on what Judy asked.
Yes.
Were there any congregants who started out hostile, but you actually saw their evolutionary process toward acceptance and their own personal growth?
Yeah. And so I'll just to kind of explain how it happens. So my grandfather, David Kanter of blessed memory, he was so against women being, active participants in leadership roles in the synagogue. I mean, like really against it, and he would rail. But when it came to his granddaughter, all bets were off, then it was fine. What I found was personal relationships are what did it actually, when they met you and when they got to know you and when they became less afraid of you. So on a number of occasions, people would, they would joke with me, like after they kind of became comfortable with me, they would say something like, well, I was really, I really wasn't happy about this in the beginning, but, if it happens, you can do my funeral, so, okay, I guess that's the vote of confidence. So, yeah, no, it did. Yeah.
And then how about young girls and young women? Did you see any that viewed you as a role model and you kind of convinced them just, by your presence to follow into their own journey?
Yeah. I don't know if I can point to, given the chance, I encourage young Jewish women to go to rabbinical school, but I'm not sure if I can directly take credit for that. But I'll tell you a little story. So in my first year in rabbinical school, I'm tutoring this little girl, and so we're learning Bible stories. And so, we're learning the life of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David. And then it's the holiday of Pentecost, Shavuot, and so on which we read the scroll of Ruth. And so I said to her, "We're gonna do the story of Ruth together." She says, "Finally, a girl," you know. And it was like, okay, yeah, maybe we should put Ruth at the beginning, you know. You know, but what it pointed to was kind of the need to actually, you know, very, very consciously highlight women. You know, one of the things that women's scholarship was doing was unearthing the stories of women that really hadn't been told, and you know, and sort of bringing those to the front and center. But you know, for the rest of us, it just meant, okay, you know, in a very conscious way, you know, we have to make sure that we're, you know, that when we're telling a story about a rabbi, we use the pronoun she, you know, even though it might be, you know, we can change the story a little bit, the message will be the same, you know. I'm not saying to, you know, to twist something around, but, you know, like when you're just kind of telling a story about Rabbi X, you know, and then you can talk about she, because they, at least at the, you know, in the early years, they never heard the rabbi she, you know, the rabbi, this is what she did. But there's one of the women whose stories, you know, became very prominent because she was, she's one of the few women mentioned in rabbinic literature, in the Talmud. So there was this woman whose name was Bruria. She was the wife of one of the rabbis of the Mishnah, of Rabbi Meir. And, you know, one of the early rabbis who, after the destruction of the temple, they kind of helped with that transformation of Judaism from sacrifice-centered to prayer and study-centered, and prayer, study, and good deeds. And so Bruria, she was this brilliant, brilliant woman. And, you know, she knew, like, you know, she knew a ton. She herself was the daughter of a rabbi. And they have stories about her besting other male rabbis in the Talmud. But you can also hear in some of these stories how frustrated she is, because there's no place for her, you know, like, you know, every so often she'll run into a rabbi on the street, and, you know, and she could tell him what to do because he doesn't know, you know, so she can instruct him. But there's no place for her to teach, and there's no place for her to lead. And, you know, I think about her because, you know, I always think, well, that could have been me, you know, if that's when I lived, you know, that's who I would have been, all dressed up and nowhere to go, you know, what you love the most, you can't do. So I always feel a lot of sympathy for Bruria and others, but it also makes me, and this is true every single day, which is like, I am just so thankful to God that I was born at a time where I could be a rabbi. You know, I just think about a lot of the women who came before, who, you know, for whom this wasn't either a possibility or, you know, and I'm just very, very grateful for that. And, you know, I think for those of us who are religious women, we're looking for a way to serve God. We're looking for a way to help the world. We're looking for a way, you know, and so I'm just thankful that, you know, that I had this opportunity where many others hadn't. I have one other funny story to tell you, but does anybody else want to, Barbara? The person with the M, I don't know. Anybody else have questions? Feel free to. So I'm in Birmingham, Alabama, which is where our family was for 7 years before we moved to Phoenix. And and I decide that I only have one life to live, and I've always wanted to learn how to play the guitar, so I'm going to go learn how to play the guitar. So I go and I find a teacher, and we're having our first guitar lesson. And, he says, so what do you do? So I said, I'm a rabbi. He said, I've never taught a woman of the cloth before. So I thought, okay, yeah, that's good. Okay, well, it's a first. One other thing, Michelle, you had mentioned as women rabbis as role models, something really important. One other thing that I think and has been become more important to me along the years. I don't know, this must be like somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago. It was the Shabbat on which you read a Torah portion that mentions a woman who is menstruating. And so I gave this sermon about menstruation and particularly having to do with some of the issues where because they don't have feminine hygiene products, girls miss school. Anyway, so there were different parts to it, but what I realized afterwards is I'm sure a number of people told me that was the first time they'd heard the word menstruation in a sermon. It just was. So being able to kind of venture into those places where male rabbis either weren't comfortable enough to venture into, or it wasn't on their radar for whatever reason. That has been so important too, because we know that that books have to reflect the diversity. Synagogues have to reflect the diversity of who we are as human beings, and really that's what's behind this whole idea of change in a women's role, which is women are images of the divine, as are men, and in order to most fully honor that, this was the way that the reform and the conservative movements understood what needed to happen.
And we have a question from Carrie. What's something you've learned late in your career that would have helped the younger you in those years when everything was so new, when you were like effectively a pioneer?
Yeah. So thank you, Carrie. This is something I would have liked to know, but it's more like an older self in general would have liked to be able to tell the younger self, relax a little bit. And the context was, in those early years, I was very, very sensitive to being in situations where, I could feel that I was a second-class citizen, and very resentful about it. What happened as I got older was I realized, I don't have to put myself in situations like that. I don't have to be in contexts like that, and that I can be in contexts that, fully appreciate myself and other people who are like me. But it's not so much about fighting a battle, in a context that, it's not going to win, rather than, going to a place that doesn't accept you and trying to be accepted. I sort of learned, what, I'm going to build my own context, or I'm going to go to a context that is, is the kind that expresses the values that I share. So in that sense, I became less, confrontative, people who want to, it still happens from time to time when I'm like in some kind of Orthodox context and I start to feel it. But most of the time I can control myself and I can, and I just say, that's them, this is me, and we're good friends.
And so if this is too personal to answer, please just say that. How was your relationship with your husband influenced by your decision to become a rabbi? What supportive, like questioning? How did that impact your relationship? And please, again, if that's too personal, just say, I'd rather not talk about that.
Yeah, no. So, my husband is a rabbi as well. And we met at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Women were not yet in the rabbinical school, but I was there taking a master's degree. But I had very good skills. So I was taking a class in the rabbinical school, even though they didn't have women in the rabbinical school, I could take the class. But because of that, I was the only woman in the class, so that's where, that's where we met. He was ahead of me, in terms of, like, I like to say, he raised my consciousness, he was way ahead of me. He came from a Reform background and, was more of a feminist than I was at that time. So he was very, very supportive. My father, who also was a rabbi, was more mixed. On the one hand, he always would encourage me, and sometimes when I would have questions and I would call him, he could give very, very, kind of compassionate and wonderful answers. But it wasn't the first few years of these changes taking place were not comfortable for him. It really did make him uncomfortable. Later on, when he and my mom actually lived in, my father lived in Phoenix for a year, my mom for 4 years. But they came and they were part of our synagogue. Then it was just taking pride in your daughter. But it wasn't without discomfort that can come, when things are new.
And you had mentioned your brothers earlier. How did they feel about it when you, actually pursued it formally, since you had been teaching them all along?
Yeah. So one of my brothers became a rabbi after me. He's my older brother. He also went to rabbinical school. And by that time, my brothers were fully on board. They were very, very supportive. So that was, they were from the beginning. They really were.
And I have a bit of a historical type of question. So in the Reform movement in 1972 in the United States, and then the conservative movement in 1985, ordained women. How about outside of the United States? Were you all influential in that capacity, or was the United States actually kind of just coming into it and other countries were already ahead, just from a historical perspective?
No. In Europe, there was actually, in the 19th century, there was a woman who basically was a rabbi. She didn't have the credential of a rabbi, but basically she functioned as a rabbi in a community in Germany. But the U.S. in some senses was, particularly again, the reform movement, they really led the way. Here, the U.S. was ahead of Israel. Israel took a little while to, and it's really conservative and reform and other forms of non-Orthodox Judaism in Israel that women began to take leadership roles there as well. Basically the U.S. a lot of, at least in the early years, the women who were from Europe who wanted to study were actually coming to the United States. So we had somebody from Germany, and we had a couple from Israel. So they came here for their studies, and then they went back to their pulpits and their communities in their home countries. But one thing I didn't think I was going to see in my lifetime, which we have, are Orthodox women rabbis. I was sure that just was not going to happen. And, it's definitely on the more modern part of the Orthodox spectrum, for sure. Some parts of Orthodoxy, heaven forbid. But there are women who are, Orthodox rabbis. Some in Israel and some here, and they don't have it easy. They have a tough time. Take my hat off to them. But it's nice to know that, things that you don't anticipate.
Yeah, and I've actually read a story, kind of a memoir about one of the women here who, has gone through that process in her Orthodox faith. So yeah, it was quite illuminating.
Oh, wonderful.
So Judy asks, and again from that historical perspective, wasn't there a woman rabbi who was ordained in Germany in the 1930s?
This was I thought it was earlier than that. Are you thinking of Regina Jonas? Yeah, you may be right. I thought she was a little bit earlier, but anyway, we're thinking of the same one. Yes. Yeah. Oh, wasn't she ordained? I don't know if it was a kind of classical ordination. I have to look that up. I know she was, she definitely was, took a leadership role, that I know, and she functioned as a rabbi. But I'm not sure if she received a kind of classical ordination. I think Judy's looking it up for us. So
I just looked it up. And this is from the Jewish Women's Archive.
Oh, good. Yeah. What does it say?
So in 1930, her thesis argued there was no law forbidding women to become rabbis. And there were many biblical and historical examples of women teaching and arbitrating Jewish law. Despite her professor's praise for her thesis, she was only granted a teaching degree, but continued to lobby for ordination, which she achieved in 1935.
Was it? Yes. Oh, that I didn't know. It's interesting how it's happening in Orthodoxy. It's in Orthodoxy now. It's basically individual rabbis are ordaining other rabbis. There's one institution that is for women Orthodox rabbis, but outside of that, like there are a few rabbis in Israel and some here who are kind of giving private ordination, which one can do. But yeah, no, on the one hand, there were people like this German rabbi, and then I think there were so many other women who I think a lot of rabbis' wives took on many rabbinic functions without the title and without the without the salary. No, I think that a lot of times many wives of rabbis or daughters of rabbis were often very learned and could often contribute in that way. So informally, they would function as community leaders. So let me just see if there was anything else I wanted to share with you before we say adios. No, I think that's all for now from me, but I'm happy if there are any other questions, any other comments. Happy to.
I have another question.
Yes, Karen.
I'm always full of questions. I'm curious about your conversations with female leaders from other faiths and how their experiences either mirror or don't mirror your own, or if you feel like you had maybe some unique experiences as a Jewish faith leader. So I just wonder if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. It's, I guess we're talking from a small sample, in terms of my, some of my Protestant and, we don't have priests in the Catholic Church, but there are, women taking leadership roles even there as well. So in my contacts, so I'm trying to remember. Before we now live in Phoenix, but kind of closer to Scottsdale. But we used to live in Central Phoenix, and there was a minister who was also my neighbor at the Beatitudes Church on Glendale and I think it's 7th Avenue, something like that. We had a really nice friendship. I think what I, in the sense that there are certain things that are in common for all religious communities. There are certain dynamics that happen between congregants and community leaders that, we definitely had in common. But I guess that there are definite cultural differences in terms of what would be a good example? I guess less having to do with us as women versus our male colleagues as sort of a particular Jewish context versus a particular Christian context, where Jews are known to be very chatty. They can talk a lot, and even in synagogue, they can be real conversationalists. We might want them to be having those conversations with God, but sometimes we're having those conversations with each other. Sort of some of the dynamics of, in some ways, the context in which she was in was much more formal. It felt much more formal than the context that I was in at the time. They were, in some ways, she had been, I can't remember how long she had been in the ministry, but it seemed to be something that was much more, whereas women rabbis were fairly new, this seemed to be something that her congregation absolutely took for granted. But Yeah. The other thing I would say is that, the word Yisrael means to struggle with God. And so we have this concept in Judaism called holy chutzpah, which is like when you are audacious and bold, even toward God, right? Often we're in a reverential, but sometimes we'll argue with God. And that's something that actually Jewish culture really treasures, this idea that human beings, like Abraham can say to God, will not the judge of all the earth do justice? That's a lot of chutzpah, that's a lot of nerve. And so that's something that we really venerate. And some in other religious contexts in which I've been in, there's it's not a concept that that people would think about. It's more about people can in some religious contexts it's just much more reverential, and the idea of like talking back to God the way Jews seem to be comfortable doing seems like a real difference.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. We're approaching that hour time limit here. And so please clap, thumbs up for Rabbi Kanter for sharing her time with us and her really important story, so that we can have a window into these experiences in history, because she really was, riding the wave of history here. I want to also remind you about our two events that we have coming in August. We have the Tri-Faith discussion on August 18th, and we hope you'll join us for that. And then we have the Muslim Bosniaks in North America on August 22nd. And so if you can't make one or the other, we will look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you to our producer, Joe. He's always so good, and he makes this such a fun experience. And we do have a couple of lovely comments in the chat as well, Rabbi Kanter. Sally said, "This has been such an honor and inspiration to learn your story. Thank you for sharing." And Mary says, "Thank you for sharing." So we do really appreciate your time and your perspective.
So my pleasure, and thank you for having me.